Imagine you're sitting in the audience and you watch a speaker give your signature story while you're sitting there. Now, that's not to say you're about to get up on stage and give that speech. You just are in the audience watching someone else give your speech. Has that ever happened to you? It happens actually to a lot of speakers. So today we're going to talk about how ethics are used in public speaking. The importance of standing in integrity and making sure that you are doing what you should as an ethical public speaker. My name is Jason Hewlett. I'm a Hall of Fame speaker. I'm excited to share with you some of the best ways for you to remain ethical every time you take the stage. They say that impersonation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I'll tell you what, when somebody outright steals your material and doesn't give you credit, that's a painful process to go through. Don't be that type of speaker. Today I'm going to give you some ideas as to how you can make sure that you stand on the right side of ethics, as well as understand how it's damaged my career as well. Let me give you an example. I started my career in Las Vegas as an entertainer, actually, before I became a speaker. And I paid somebody over $100,000 to create for me a show that I could take to the Las Vegas Strip. I already had a good show, but I decided I wanted to have a producer who told me he could help me. $100,000. Think about paying that much, and this was in early 2000s. Now, I was young. I was trying my best, and eventually I found out as I performed those routines that he helped me put together that he had gone from show to show across the strip and had stolen the best material from the artists that were my heroes. It was pretty painful for me to realize that I was now doing a show that was written and I had paid for it, but it was all material unethically lifted from other artists. It damaged my reputation. People thought it was me that had stolen the material, when it wasn't me at all. All of us have our challenges we have to go through. I hope that I can help you jump past and through some of the challenges that I've gone through in order for you to not have to do the same. One more example before we jump right in. I was sitting watching a Zoom presentation, a big webinar with some very popular people, and all of a sudden a speaker came on whom I knew and is a friend of mine, who then used every single piece of my entire speech, almost word for word, having recreated my slides, slide for slide. I couldn't believe it. I could even tell that the other speakers on this webinar were sitting there thinking, I think this is someone else's speech. What was frustrating is watching the wonderful feedback that was had in the name of the person who gave my speech without attributing any of it to me. When we have to have those types of conversations with somebody, it's awkward, it's hard. But when I reached out to that speaker, that person didn't realize that this was unethical. And so, in other words, we sat and worked on helping him create a better speech for himself, instead of using all of my material. This is a form of flattery, I understand, but equally, it can't happen, so don't be that kind of speaker. Let's jump right in with why it matters. The essence of ethical speaking is that there's a foundation that we build our character upon. People will know us really quickly in this small world of speaking if we're that type of speaker that steals material. This happens in the world of comedy quite often. It's a tragic thing because these great comedians have their incredible bits, and then somebody comes along and piecemeals together their own comedy show, and everybody knows they're stealing. Eventually they will be blacklisted and won't be able to get work. The same thing happens in the speaking world. I've seen this where a speaker will come along and start taking other people's best stuff and put it together as their own. The real part about ethics is create your own material. Authentically come up with what you want to talk about. Unfortunately, so often people think I can just take a quote from here and a story from there and something from somebody else and utilize it. I was sitting at a speaker training with other speakers. There was about 100 of us in the room. A newer speaker stood up on stage and started telling a story, word for word, of the person I was sitting next to. The person I sat next to is a legend of speaking who had multiple books. The man sitting next to me started to fidget, and I looked over and he looked at me like, can you believe this? We didn't know if we should put a stop to it or let the speaker continue. What this legend did was pull out his book out of his briefcase and flipped open to the chapter and showed me as I sat and read word for word while that speaker gave this man's very story. These types of things happen way too often. Don't be that type of speaker. Now, that speaker who shared that story has eventually come up with his own, but unfortunately, the relationship of that speaker has never been the same, and the ethics or the reputation of that speaker cannot be rectified with the people that know the truth. And so when you speak, tell the truth. When you speak, share your stories. Authentically share that which you've got. Let's talk about recognizing unethical practices. When it comes to normal and common pitfalls of unethical speaking, what happens a lot nowadays, because the internet is so amazing, is that you can find a quote from anybody and there's no attribution to the original author. Now, this is a hard thing to find because so many people pass it off as if it's their own. I've fallen into this trap myself, where I thought, oh, I came up with that, but it was something I had heard. What I appreciate is when another speaker or somebody smarter than me reaches out and says, hey, that's so-and-so's quote, or that came from here, make sure to give attribution. I feel that there is a common ethics between speakers that we are to reach out to one another and say, hey, by the way, attribute that to the right person. Obviously, there are going to be speakers that utilize quotes and stories and other things from other people, but if you can find a way to give credit, don't plagiarize. You can come up with your own variation on a quote, but maybe you could say, when Shakespeare said this, this is how I say it. That's okay to do, but don't try to pass it off as your own. There's a lot of impact that happens when somebody's passing it off as their own because it affects a lot of people down the line. For example, years ago, I was watching a show where the comedian stood up on stage and he did the entire routine of one of my best friends. When he was all done with the presentation, he came off stage to a rounding applause. Everybody was thrilled with him. And next thing we know, I said to him, hey, that's my friend Sean's routine. Why did you do that? And he said, well, I made it my own. It's okay. Guess what happened? The next year they booked Sean, who created that bit. He stood up on stage, started doing it, and the crowd was like, we saw the guy last year do this. It ruined the whole night for everybody, but the originator of it was the guy who followed the man who cheated him first. Oh man, this kind of thing happens a lot. You don't want to be on the back end of that. You don't want to be on the front end where somebody can no longer trust you. I could no longer book that comedian, and I can't do that with speakers as well. Because at the same time as I'm a performer and speaker on stage, I also send a lot of referrals to people. Ethics matter. We're not going to forget who lifts material. So there's some gray areas of inspiration. And this is kind of a tricky thing to talk about because imitation and inspiration and those types of things really have a fine line. But as they say, impersonation is the sincerest form of flattery. The challenge is this. If I were to stand up on stage and start singing a song that I said, this is a song I wrote, or I just started singing it without giving credit to that artist, that actually is plagiarism. You need to give credit to the artist you're singing their song of, or the poem of somebody that wrote it, or the story of someone who first gave it. In other words, it's okay to imitate people. Trust me, I imitate people, but I don't go, ha, la, 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 that's me. No, that's Pee Wee Herman, la, la, la. So I'll always give attribution to the originator. There's ethical borrowing. That's also an interesting way about this. There's a writer, author, speaker, coach, Simon Sinek, one of the greats. If you've read Start With Why, you know what I'm talking about. He created this thing called the Golden Circle and Start With Why, and everybody talks about what's your why. Simon Sinek most likely did not create what's your why. People have been talking about that for a long time. He just packaged it in the right way. However, if people are starting to talk about the circle that Simon Sinek created and Start With Why and are using quotes and other type of data from his book, you should give him credit. I've worked with speakers that have thought, this is my material, I'm just going to share it. And I'm like, no, that's Simon Sinek's material. You have to give him attribution. And so as long as we say, in Simon Sinek's book, he talks about this, and then you show it, then you'll pretty much be safe, unless they have a consulting and coaching, train the trainer type of program that you have to buy in order to share their material. So make sure to look into that. Ethical borrowing. When we talk about building your ethical toolkit, I hope that some of what I've shared has already been helpful. Whether it's ethical borrowing or giving attribution, really it comes down to just creating your own authentic material. Candidly, that's the easiest way to stay out of trouble. When you read something, to just share that you read it in this book. Or when you see something online, to say, I saw something funny the other day. In fact, I give credit to somebody, I don't even know his name, but there's an image I show that at every single gig, I've been sharing it for years. And at an event recently, somebody shouted out that it looked like Snoop Dogg. They said, "That's Snoop Dogg." And it got a huge laugh at the gig. So now I use that as a part of the event. I'll say, you know, the last time I showed this to an audience, a guy shouted out, "That looks like Snoop Dogg." And it gets me my biggest laugh with that image. And then I say, "That's not Snoop Dogg, that's Stevie Wonder." And then that gets another laugh. I'm giving him credit though by saying, at another event, a guy shouted out. And so in other words, I'm not pretending I created it. Come up with your own authentic material. If something organic happens, then share it that that's how it organically happened. It'll keep you above the level of ethics. And then there's ChatGPT and AI. Oh my gosh. This is a crazy time of life that this is coming at us so fast. What the challenge is with ChatGPT and AI is that this is all material that's already been created and now it's being cultivated into one place or curated so that we can utilize it. Now, does that mean it's original to you? That's a tough one, isn't it? And so when it comes to asking questions of ChatGPT, getting references and resources, you also want to do your homework because ChatGPT may not have been updated and you need to make sure it's updated. Sometimes it even makes things up actually. So make sure that you check out and research what you're talking about. As the world changes with AI, it's going to get trickier and trickier to know who's the originator of it. And so the more opportunities you have to create your own material and be authentic, the better you'll be with being ethical as a speaker. So here's some actionable takeaways for ethical speaking. Creative journaling. I would say keep a journal of all your thoughts and the ideas that you're going to share on stage. This is a great way to make sure that you're constantly creating and capturing ideas where they come from everywhere, stories, examples, even keeping clippings from the newspaper or printing things off on the internet. Just keep a journal of all of those great ideas for you to be able to cull them and pull from for your next speech. How about ethical checks? I mean, think about the time when you've created something and you think, did I create that? I remember I played a song once that I thought I wrote. I really did. I was playing it and I was like, man, this sounds like something. Played it for my wife and she goes, "Oh, that's Saturday in the Park by Chicago." And I was like, oh yeah. So subliminally, I thought I had created it. My favorite example of this is Paul McCartney. Sir Paul McCartney of the Beatles, one of the greatest songwriters of all time. Whenever he would write a song and he thought it was so good, he thought, maybe this is something Beethoven, Bach, or Mozart wrote. And he would play it for a lot of people, just the tune, and say, "Do you know this song?" And they would say, "No, I've never heard that." Once he asked enough credible people, he knew, oh, this is an original idea. And then he would write the completed song. This is what happened with songs like Yesterday and others. It's also important to have continuing education as a part of your practice. You know, to continue to make sure that you understand the ethical practices of the way that you do your career. In fact, with the National Speakers Association, we live at a code of ethics that we have to keep by. And if somebody reports us to the NSA and says, "Hey, I think they're breaking something ethically," well, the next thing you know, you're going to have a meeting and they might strip you away of your designations. You don't want that. So my call to action on this video is going to be different than any video I've ever done. And I would love for you to take the pledge of being an ethical speaker with me. I call it the promise. And that's all you have to do is type in the comments for me, "I promise." Here's the pledge. I pledge that I will create my own material, that I will live ethically as a speaker, that I will give attribution when and where I can find it, that either as a comedian, an entertainer, a singer, a performer, a speaker, a coach, a trainer, a consultant, all the different ways in which you're going to be on stage, that you'll live ethically and share material that is ethical. Put "I promise" in the comments. I appreciate the way that you live an ethical life.